The Shout is a 1978 movie directed by the Polish director Jerzy Skolimowski, produced by the legendary Jeremy Thomas, the producer of some of British cinema's greatest and strangest films: Crash, Bad Timing, Insignificance, Naked Lunch. And it's based on a short story by Robert Graves, who is the man who, you could say, invented folk horror when he wrote his book The White Goddess, a study of folklore. With these ingredients, it couldn't help but be interesting, but is it actually any good? I'm going to say yes, it is an extraordinary film, and you're in for an extraordinary experience if you haven't seen it before. My name is Paul Duane. I'm a filmmaker. I made a film called All You Need Is Death last year, which The Shout was one of many influences on. I love this movie. The film's about identity swapping, the kind of thing you'd see in David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, for instance. It's about sympathetic magic, which is the use of an object belonging to another person to control their actions, which turned up, I think, in Oz Perkins' film Longlegs this year, and often turns up in folk horror movies. There's also a cuckold dynamic, which is straight out of a seedy 1970s porn movie. But mostly it's about a man who has learned to kill with the sound of his own voice. And it's about the idea of storytelling and unreliable narrators, storytellers you should not trust. One of whom tells this story, that's Crossley, played by Alan Bates, who is introduced as the smartest man in the madhouse, and he is a mental patient in an asylum. So you know from the beginning that his story might not be entirely reliable. He's telling us his story while he is scoring a cricket game between the doctors and the inmates in the madhouse. Now, throughout the story, it's interesting to watch how differently the three main characters play out in his story as he tells it, in the cricket match that threads through the narrative, and in the framing story that begins and ends the film. There are subtle differences, and they're all very interesting. He's telling the story to a very young Tim Curry, who plays a character called Robert Graves, after the author of the story, who was, among other things, an expert on folklore and mythology, and who also served in World War I and suffered a very bad case of what was then called shell shock, but which we would now call PTSD. And the story, The Shout, seems in part to be inspired by this experience. Graves' life inspired a lot of things in this story. He was also in a polyamorous relationship with two women, one of whom he felt had supernatural powers and could control elements of his life. And he used some of the experiences that he had, and he combined them with his mythological studies to create the story of The Shout. The original story relates The Shout back to the ancient Irish Celtic goddess Neman, who could kill 100 men with her battle cry, apparently. He also talks about Hector and the Trojan Wars, the Greek deity Pan, and the etymology of the word panic. Like Graves, Crossley turns his own story, his own trauma, into a story. And as seems to happen in The Shout, the actual fictional story becomes real, because after writing The Shout, Graves's menage a trois was overturned by the arrival of a libidinous Irish male poet who entered it, came between him and the other women, seems to have had sex with all three of them, and then ran off with the one who he felt had supernatural powers. In the mid-70s, many years after the story was written, screenwriter Michael Austen brought the story, The Shout, to producer Jeremy Thomas, who thought it was brilliant and wanted Nicholas Roeg to direct it. Roeg was too busy, and he brought it instead to Jerzy Skolimowski, who I think is an absolutely perfect choice. Skolimowski's Polish eye renders England into a place of hidden terrors and a landscape of dread. If you haven't seen his other films set in the UK, Deep End and Moonlighting, you really should. They're two of the best British films of the 70s and 80s, I think. During the Second World War, Skolimowski was a kid, and that's where he learned a lot about acting, because he had to, whenever the Gestapo came to the door, he had to go and run and jump up and down on his bed and play, because underneath the bed was hidden a printing press where his parents used to print newspapers to give to the resistance. His father was executed by the Nazis during the war, and after the war, as a reward for his parents' sacrifice, Skolimowski was sent to a special school where he worked alongside future filmmakers like Ivan Passer and Milos Forman, and the future president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel. He ended up, before he became a filmmaker, he ended up becoming a poet, a jazz drummer, and then a boxer, which are all good groundings for making films. The cast is pretty great. We have John Hurt, a year before he made Alien, as the experimental sound recordist whose life is overturned by the arrival of Crossley. His wife is played by Susanna York, just before she played Superman's mum. And of course, Alan Bates is Crossley, and he is absolutely extraordinary as the man with the shout that kills. Apparently, when Skolimowski asked Jack Nicholson's advice on casting, Nicholson said, "You got to get a guy with a thick neck," and Bates really fits the bill. You will also get to see a young Jim Broadbent covering himself in shit, which does not happen in many 1970s films for some reason. So, in a film called The Shout, about a guy with a shout that can kill, the actual shout itself has to be impressive for the film to work. And this was the first British film to make use of the Dolby optical stereo sound system, certainly the first art house film to use it, probably in the world. Skolimowski decided to use it just for the shout. He said producers normally insist on it being used all the way through so they can get their money's worth, but he wanted to save it for the big moment, and it really does work. The shout itself is a mixture of 40 different recordings, one of which is Skolimowski's own scream, because he couldn't find anyone else, he said, that was capable of screaming, not stopping, for 23 seconds. There's also the sound of a rocket launch to the moon and Niagara Falls mixed in there. Sonic weapons were kind of in the mix in the 70s. In the north of Ireland, the British Army was was credited in New Scientist magazine as having used a sonic weapon called the squawk box to control crowds. They denied it, as they would, of course. The other people who I remember using that kind of thing were the industrial noise pioneers Throbbing Grizzle, who tried to play sounds during their gigs that would make their audience lose control of their bowels. The 70s was a very interesting time. You'll also see 3 reproductions of Francis Bacon paintings prominently displayed in the film. They are paralytic child walking on all fours, head 6, and reclining nude. Some people have said that they represent the 3 characters at the centre of the film, Crossley and the husband and wife. That's up to you to decide. I think it's an interesting thought. Skolimowski said, "I took a lot of inspiration from the work of Francis Bacon, even though I find his work repulsive. He gave me an understanding of the meaning of life. He's in touch with reality." He also said, "The shout was a chance to smuggle the impossible into total reality. I started as a poet. I'm not afraid to wander away from direct narrative, and I feel safe with a story that tempts you both to disbelieve and to believe." The collapse of reason, the collapse of identity, the collapse of reality. That's what the story's about. But it's kept in a sort of structure by the continuing return to what seems the stability of the ongoing cricket match, the greens, the sound of the cricket bat striking. It all seems very normal until suddenly it doesn't. The other interesting element you might spot is the appearance of an Aboriginal shaman at the beginning of the film. You could say cultural appropriation, or you could say the return of the repressed. You could call it the revenge of the colonized. It's up to you to decide. There are dualities that recur across the story. There's civilization versus barbarism. There's rationality versus magic. And there's fertility versus infertility. But fundamentally, it is a horror story, and as such, it is incredibly effective. Robert Graves described it like this: "My shout is not a matter of tone or vibration, but something not to be explained. It is a shout of pure evil, and there is no one place fixed for it on the scale. It is pure terror." I hope you enjoy The Shout.